Lessons learned in the first year on the field. It's coming up next on Spin City's Farm. Hey everybody, welcome to part 2 of my 3-part mini-series of lessons learned in my first year. If you haven't seen the first one, which is talking about lessons learned before you get started farming, check that one out, link right up here. That one is really geared towards people who have, thought about maybe starting a farm, but they haven't gotten going on their first season yet. Whereas parts 2 and 3 can apply to really any farm, hopefully, especially if you're having some trouble in a few areas. Hopefully there's a nugget or two in parts 2 and 3 that can kind of help push you past those struggles. I forgot to mention in part 1, but I'll mention it here. This video series also ties into an interview that I did on Diego Fooder's podcast, and I'll link to that probably in the description of this video once that one's up as well. Diego and I had a conversation talking about lessons learned in the first year and reflecting on those right at the end of your first season. And we talked about some of these points, not all of them. I elaborated on some of them in different ways than I will here. So hopefully, between this content and that, with Diego I also talked about a lot of other things besides lessons learned. But if you are looking for that kind of lessons learned component, definitely check out my interview with him, as well as a lot of his other content. Super great. His podcast, he's doing a lot of stuff on YouTube now. So big shout out to Diego Fooder and all the content and work that he's doing for us newer farmers. So without further ado, here is the number 1 of 5 lessons learned in the first season for on the field. The first one is get a sod cutter. Buy one, rent one, borrow one, don't steal one. Not a good idea. Get your hands on a sod cutter. Get rid of the sod. I tried just using the tarping method. I was pressed for time. I didn't get my first tarp on my first lot until December 20-somethingth. I have a video of it elsewhere on the channel. You can check that out, of me rolling that tarp out for the very first time. And then on my second lot, I didn't get that tarp out until February, and I pulled these tarps off to break ground in, I think it was March or April. Again, I have another video of that, but that was not enough time. If you're in a position where you can leave a tarp on for an entire calendar year, then, maybe you can brush past this lesson learned. But if you're in any kind of compressed time frame, and time is not going to be able to do the work for you, save yourself the work. Buy, rent, borrow, trade for, get your hands on a sod cutter. Whether it's a power one or a manual kick style one. Cut the sod in the top couple inches of the soil off and get it out of there. I made the mistake on both of my lots of grinding that in. That grass wasn't dead. It was weakened, but it wasn't dead yet. The energy that was stored in the roots had not been totally depleted, and all I did was grind those roots and rhizomes into the soil at a deeper level. So what ended up happening? I ended up fighting grass, lawn, turf, grass, all season. It was my number 1 weed. I basically didn't have much, if any, other weed pressure, a few things here and there, but by and large, my beds were relatively weed-free, except for grass. Now, had I cut the sod off to begin with, then, oh man, I'd had no weed pressure at all, both from grass and other species, because it's just, that's where your seed bank is. You're cutting it off and removing it off site. I recently went through this process. I actually made this list before I did this process, but I just went through this on another new lot. Having learned this lesson in my first season, I said, not doing that again, not grinding the grass in again. I bought a manual style kick type sod cutter, cut all the grass off, piled it off to the side in kind of a perimeter area. We've got it tarped. We're going to let that grass all totally die off under that tarp, and then it just will become compost, and then we'll reapply it right on site. It's not leaving. We're not removing any of that, topsoil or anything permanently. It will eventually make its way right back onto the beds. I can't think of a more important on-the-field lesson. That's why it's number one. I fought grass all season. I spent hours weeding it and pulling it out. It affected my yields. It affected the speed of the post-harvest process. You're picking blades of grass out. I mean, there's nothing worse than just like fighting something and knowing that you could have dealt with it so easily. On this new lot, it's about 1,500 square feet. It took 2 guys with a manual style sod cutter, a total of 12 hours, to strip 1,500 feet and get it all piled up. That's really not that much when you consider it. On 1,500 square feet, just for reference, I can fit 18 25-foot beds. So if you're thinking about, okay, your space, okay. Now, if I had a power or gasoline-powered sod cutter and a third person, and one person was just running the sod cutter and the other 2 people were just picking it up and piling it, I'm guessing you could get that done in a half day or so and just fly through it, on that 1,500 square feet. So based on your context, kind of grow out from there. If you're in any kind of position where you can't let time do the work underneath the tarp, just cut the sod off. Just be done with it. Spend the money, spend the time, spend the labor, because in the long run, in a season or 2 seasons worth of time, you will have saved yourself the money in labor costs, and you will have saved the labor itself in the long run. Lesson number 2 on the field from my first season. It ties into that first one quite a bit. And if you plan on using flame weeding as a strategy for weed mitigation, do not start farming until you own that flame weeder or have your hands on it if you're borrowing one. Getting back to the first lesson learned about the sod, I tilled in my sod, but I had 2 lots. On one of the lots, I started planting beds before I owned a flame weeder. I didn't start planting beds on my other lot until after I owned my flame weeder. And it's like I was harvesting and farming and planting in 2 different hemispheres on 2 different farms with 2 different farmers running the operations. And that's simply because before the first plantings at Lot A, I didn't flame weed before those first plants went in. And at Lot B, I did. And at Lot A, it was fight grass, especially grass, fight other weeds the whole time. Now, luckily at that lot, I've got at least a 3-year tenure, so I can break down that weed bank. And even over the course of the season, I could definitely tell from rotation to rotation that it was becoming less. But even at the end of the season on Lot A, I had still not gotten rid of enough of the weed bank and the seed bank and the grass pressure as compared to Lot B, even in its first rotation. It was night and day. If you're not using flame weeding as a technique, if you've got a big enough acreage that you can just rotate tarping, and I've heard about several farmers who are not using flame weeding and they're just tarping for huge segments of time, 2 to 3 months at a time, then fine, skip this point, move on. But if flame weeding's in your strategy, then don't start your farm without it. Lesson 3 for on the field in my first season is to have a plan for your walkways and perimeters. Again, at that Lot A that I was talking about, where I got it started and got planting before I owned my flame weeder, there were some walkways and perimeter type areas that just got nasty. And of course that was after I owned my flame weeder, but that's because I didn't flame weed those areas right off the bat, right in the beginning of the season, and stuff started to get big. Other parts of the farm are busy, dealing with another job, dealing with a family, building a customer base, taking on new customers every week, every month, and it's just, what falls to the wayside? Taking care of the perimeter areas, because they don't make me any money anyway. Why would I go spend time in the middle of July to weed them when it's super hot? Had I put in a couple hours of work in April when I first broke ground and formed out beds, then yes, these perimeter and walkway areas would have never become a problem. They would have never encroached on my beds. They would have never, impacted my workflow, etc. So before you get going on that first season, have a plan. Whatever it is, that's fine. You're going to use tarps or landscape fabrics. You're going to do wood chips. You're going to constantly flame weed it and till it and use stirrup hose and things like that. Whatever the plan is, just have one. I had one but didn't implement it. That's the other key thing. Like, you can make all the plans you want in the world, but you gotta actually do them. So I bought an extra wide landscape fabric for this perimeter area that I'm talking about, and I just never got around to putting it out until the stuff around the perimeter was 3 feet high almost, and an eyesore and obnoxious. Till finally one day I was like, this is unbearable. I knocked it down, put the tarp on top of it, and now it's dealt with. But that was several hours of work that I had to spend, versus if I would have done it in April, I could have just rolled the tarp out and been done in 20 minutes. So again, have a strategy and implement it for your perimeters and walkways. Lesson number 4 for on the field, taken from my first year, is to walk the field every day. A lot of us that are just getting into farming might not live directly on the farm. You might have to commute. You might be multi-locational in an urban setting like me. But this shouldn't stop you from getting out there and at least getting eyes on the field or fields every day in the first season. Now, as you become more and more experienced, you might be able to skip a day or two here and there, especially if it's far away and you have no other reason to go there. This is particularly getting to folks in their first season or your first season on a new lot. So even you experienced farmers out there can take away from this if you're increasing either the number of lots or you're expanding into a new block or something like that. Well, why is this? For several reasons. Particularly for us urban farmers, we're competing with trees and buildings and fences and light posts and power line poles and everything else and retaining walls that cast shade. And I don't care what fancy app you've got. I don't care how good your eyeball is. Nothing is better than being out there at all times of day, morning, midday, afternoon, sunrise and sunset, and looking at every day where that sun is hitting. What shade is being cast on your beds. And obviously, if you've got a trained eye to this, you can get kind of keen on it and just kind of get a sense of it by standing on the lot. But you need to be out there every day to learn your lot. Learn where the shade is coming every day at all times of day. Also to wind, too. Learn where the winds are coming in, how they're shifting, how they're changing throughout the season, what your pressures are from that wind. Maybe this is going to change where you do and do not plant things. You can get out there and get eyes on your crops. I mean, there's nothing worse than having skipped a couple days because of some extenuating circumstance and then getting back out there and finding that you've missed the peak window to harvest something, particularly root crops, but greens also. Or maybe there's some kind of irrigation failure and you didn't see it. And you're learning the cycles of your crops, what your average days to germination are at different times of year, in the spring, in the summer, in the fall. You're learning your days to maturity after germination. You're watching for poor germination. Maybe you need to say, we need to get rid of this bed, return it over and replant because I only had 60% germination. Well, if you're not out there every day looking at that and making those calls, you're losing out on 2, 3, 4 extra days to get that turned over and get another crop in. So particularly in your first season as a farmer or in your first season in a new space, be out there every day, learning that space, learning the crop cycles for your climate. If you move farms, obviously, if you move geographic areas, even, if you're used to farming in a city and you move just outside of that city, even 20, 30 miles, that's going to change a lot, especially in the springs and falls. So you really want to be out there all the time watching for frost, etc. Just watching for pests, because your pests are going to change when you move out of the city versus in the city. So be out there every day. Even if you're not working in the field, just walk the walkways, walk the perimeters, pull a couple weeds here and there, you know, keep an eye on your stuff. And the fifth lesson learned on the field in my first season is to just be confident. And I had this going in. I'd worked on other farms, as I talked about in part 1. But I see it all the time in the YouTube comments, in the success groups, hear these questions in seminars and stuff, and it's just like, what can I grow this in this area? I'm so worried. Oh, I can't grow a house plant. How am I going to farm? Every plant is a weed if it's in the wrong context. An apple tree is a weed if I'm trying to grow corn. Plants want to grow. That is their biological function. You put a seed in the ground, you give it a little water, a little bit of time, and a little bit of soil on top. That wants to grow. It wants to germinate. It wants to grow. That plant wants to stay alive. In many cases, you'd have to be trying to kill your stuff to get it to not grow. Now, obviously, yes, you need to dial in things perfectly to maximize yields and dial it in perfectly to get your rotations perfect to maximize profit and all this stuff. Yes, those things take time and energy and years of experience to hone those in and dial them in. But the act of getting a plant to grow is not really that hard, everybody. Be confident in your ability to at least get some yield. Take that stress, take that mental energy that you're devoting to, can I get this stuff to grow or not? Who's having success in 4B with this crop? Like, the plants are going to grow. Unless you're trying to grow bananas in northern Canada, it's going to grow. And take that energy that you were worrying about this stuff with and worry about finding another customer or dialing in your yields or anything else that is not something about, can I get this stuff to grow? The plants are going to grow. Just be confident in them, and you'll have confidence in not only your crops but in your whole farm, and that confidence will come off when you're approaching new customers, when you're talking to people at the farmers market, etc. So to recap, 5 lessons learned on the field in my first season. Get a sod cutter and get that sod out of there. If you're going to be flame weeding as a weed mitigation technique, don't start your farm till after you've got it. Have a plan and implement it for your perimeters and walkways. Get out there and walk your field, get eyes on every day, and be confident in your crops that they are going to grow and that you're going to get at least some yield to start cutting your teeth and refining your techniques with. This has been part 2 of my lessons learned in the first season mini-series, focusing on lessons learned from in the field. If you haven't already, check out part 1, which was lessons learned from before you get started, and stay tuned for part 3, where I'm going to talk about lessons learned that apply off the field. Thanks for checking it out. See you next time on Spin City's Farm.